Back when MultiVersus was in beta, I did a quick review of it from my perspective as a player and content creator for Smash and other platform fighters. My final verdict was that I liked it, but it had some glaring issues that needed to be addressed. Well, the full game's just been released, and I'm happy to say that some of those issues actually have been fixed pretty substantially. Not everything has, though, and it introduces some new issues of its own that have proven to be pretty divisive among the fan base. So, let's dive in and take a look. Hey everyone, so MultiVersus has been patched several times over the course of making this video, including a big one that went out just now, which for me is the morning after I pulled an all-nighter so I could start rendering the video. So I'm gonna frantically run through and patch up anything I said that's out of date, but check the pinned comment. If I missed anything, that's where it'll be. You're also gonna see a few combos in the background that don't work anymore, that sort of stuff, but that really shouldn't affect anything. Okay, so we're gonna be talking about MultiVersus as it compares to the beta, MultiVersus as a game in general, but first, we need to open with some talk about the discourse around the game. I'd frankly rather not do this, but it's pretty much impossible to avoid. Player First Games made the conscious decision to slow the speed of gameplay down in between its beta and the full release, and to say the core fanbase hasn't taken it very well would be an understatement. I obviously can't speak for the developers here, but I suspect the sheer amount of backlash over this decision legitimately caught them off guard. That said, I'd be shocked if they didn't expect to receive backlash of any kind though. They know the hardcore crowd around their game exists and is the most vocal online, so it raises an interesting question. Why did they decide to do this? What do they gain by slowing the gameplay down? Well, to start, MultiVersus is unique in that it promotes doubles as its primary game mode, a naturally far more chaotic and fast-paced environment, and slowing things down makes it easier for players and viewers to follow. This also ties into their decision to make the character models bigger and the camera more zoomed in, changes which have also been controversial, but I unambiguously like. I do think in singles the camera is pushed in slightly too far right now. I don't think the top of your head should get cut off just by jumping, and it doesn't do a great job showing things like traps or dynamic terrain that's too far away from the players. That could probably use some more adjustment, but the principle behind pushing the camera in closer to traditional fighter territory is actually something I like. It does make the action easier to follow and does make spacing a little bit cleaner to gauge. I think the bigger concern was still likely doubles though, where the developers continue to fight an uphill battle to make that format spectator friendly, which was one of my biggest concerns with MultiVersus since it was announced, and I think these changes serve it well. Online play with rollback netcode is also a critical feature of the game, and because rollback algorithms continuously attempt to predict and correct where assets are going to be on screen, this gets smoother if characters are moving smaller distances between each frame. A lower speed makes the game more accessible and easier to jump into for newer players, at least on a base level, and not targeting the diehards, an audience of, generously, a couple million people with extremely stringent preconceptions, is not necessarily the wrong call. Part of this slowdown also comes from making it less practical to constantly slingshot around the screen, a vital technique in high-level beta play that greatly de-emphasized disadvantage state and mind games. The decision to reduce overall gameplay speed and the decision to modify advanced movement mechanics are technically distinct from each other, but they do coalesce into the game's overall feel in a way that's hard to separate. So, that's actually a lot of very substantial benefits Player First Games gets by slowing down the pace. What's lost in the transition? What do they give up for these? Because there are legitimate, objective issues with cranking down a fighting game's speed. It makes it easier to accidentally perform follow-up inputs too early, an issue exacerbated by probably the single worst implementation of an input buffer I've ever seen. It's 30 frames long, a half second, and releasing all inputs doesn't clear the buffer queue, which results in some pretty wild misinputs. A lower speed creates more dead time in situations where the outcome is predetermined. Have you been flung off stage but are now landing uncontested? You already know you're landing, so the extra time it takes to get to that position is essentially wasted time. The same applies to deciding how you're going to navigate around a projectile. In line with the game design principle that dictates after a player has discovered the solution to a puzzle, it should ideally take as little time as possible to execute that solution. Slow speed reduces the ability to express characterization through their physical traits. The gap between the fastest and slowest MultiVersus characters is certainly noticeable, but less so than in many other platform fighters. That said, when you look for instances of people criticizing MultiVersus' speed, you don't really find any of the kind of stuff I've just brought up. You find a lot of stuff like this.
When you have the speed element and you have that level of difficulty, the layer of difficulty on top of something, it makes it special. It makes it last in a way.
Now, to be very clear, this is not a dig at Hungrybox, especially when he's speaking off the cuff while trying to entertain a stream, but I'm using him as a surrogate for a lot of similar observations I heard that all sound kind of hand-wavy. I'm yet to see anyone explain why having a different pace than their usual game that they've sunk thousands of hours into is objectively a negative, only that they prefer the feel of what they're used to. This isn't really anything all that new either. Brawl spent its entire lifespan simultaneously having a thriving community and being torn to shreds for being slower and floatier than Melee. I've seen Rivals 2 players get upset that it plays more like Smash and less like the original Rivals of Aether, same between the Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl entries, and while it may be the inverse for MultiVersus, I'd say the full release actually deviates further from the Smash series than the beta did. It's a familiar phenomenon. I think what sets things apart this time, though, is that this is supposed to be the same game. There's no sequelization here, so of course players were expecting a similar experience to what they had before. To be met with something so drastically different feeling with no priming beyond some, frankly, pretty poor marketing material that soured the tone right from the start was always going to be jarring. You can argue how fair this is, you can argue how fair it is that content creators who come from much faster games and may not even be the target audience get to dominate so much of the discourse around this game. What you can't argue is that nobody could possibly have seen this coming. You can't argue that the marketing and social media teams losing total control of the narrative around a game meant to be a marketing juggernaut isn't an issue for everyone involved. Sure, on a conceptual level it may not be objectively better or worse to make the game slower, but on a meta level it still was potentially a problematic call, because a more negative discourse concretely translates to fewer players, and therefore worse matchmaking, less support coming into further development, etc. Some of the game's sluggish feeling also comes from the fundamentals of its controls. MultiVersus uses entirely digital inputs. If you're playing with a controller, you can't tilt the stick a little bit to get a walk like you can in Smash, which isn't actually unheard of among platform fighters, especially ones that will also be on PC and therefore need to accommodate keyboards. This creates some wrinkles that need to be ironed out though. For example, how do you decide whether to drop through a platform or crouch on it? With analog control, that would just be determined by how much the stick was tilted, but since that's not an option here, the developers assigned down to crouching and down plus jump, or double tapping down to a drop through. On keyboard or D-pad, this probably works just fine, and is how keyboard players in something like Rivals of Aether already handle this action. With a stick though, it feels clunky, and considering how integral platform movement is in the platform fighter genre, anything that makes this feel worse or more prone to miss inputs, even a little, hurts the overall game feel significantly. This double tap method was also brought over to instant dash attacks, which again feels just a little clumsy to perform with a stick. It's not awful, but it certainly feels worse than, for example, the Smash series method of just flicking both sticks at the same time. The devs implemented one simple, universal solution for everything, which is passable, but when you've got far smaller scale platform fighters managing to let analog and digital controls coexist without issue, I don't really see why it's unfair to ask for it here too, especially when the game's also intended for multiple consoles. If they didn't want to handle stuff like walk cycles or moves with increments of smaller than 45 degrees, that stuff would still be fine to leave out and would change virtually nothing about the underlying design. I'm not sure if building some leeway into the digital input was also responsible for how long you need to run before a dash attack is active in MultiVersus compared to other platform fighters. Unusually, characters won't do them unless they're at full running momentum. My first thought was that it was a balancing factor, but considering instant dash attacks do still exist, that seems unlikely. Another weird muscle memory mangler is using the right stick to get a jab, your traditional fast 3-hit move, while simply tapping A gives you a slow, heavy, forward smash-esque attack. It took a while to get used to, and once in a blue moon I still do find myself tapping A in a scramble, but I am generally a convert at this point. The right stick method is useful for some advanced techniques, and jabs are generally more useful overall, making the easier turnarounds welcome, even if there is a dedicated button that lets you do turnaround neutral attacks as well. It's not like I had much of a choice but to convert though. The ability to toggle between inputs in the control settings has been removed since the beta, along with the ability to adjust that awful input buffer, and those were not the only victims. Online free-for-all mode is gone, you can't toast an opponent back with a button press anymore, post-game reports are gone, advanced tutorials, offline play, and there's a bunch of other weird stuff too. I was not prepared for just how garish and messy the shop was going to be, for example. For you? Huh? I don't even play any of these characters. How are these for me? Then there's custom cart, and I have no idea what that means. Why does clicking on the right arrow scroll the bar more than halfway, but then clicking the left arrow only increments back one at a time? Wait, now the right arrow is incrementing. Look man, I just want the edgy Wonder Woman skin. Where's that? Oh, the Prestige store. This looks edgy. Nope, that's a different currency. Seriously, where can I just see all of the character skins so I know which ones to go after? As it turns out, there is no straight up skins shop in here. To see a list, you need to go into the character select screen. Selecting one of these tells you it's going to send you to the shop, but not that shop. Except, no, some skins still don't show up here. They're in that shop. Yeah, this UI is kind of a mess. Why is it that when I move between the perk collection row and the specific perk row, a secondary selection box just blinks in and out, making it hard to tell at a quick glance what row I'm even in? Why does it do this every time I move up? Why is the text shrinking so much here, to the point it's almost unreadable? Why are these perk descriptions in slowly scrolling windows when there's an acre of space to display the full thing? Why does the training mode feel a decade out of date? What do you mean ranked mode is coming soon? It's been coming for the year the game's been offline. Why is this beta-esque string constantly in the bottom corner? I've never seen that in a full release before. Why is my character screaming at me before I've even closed the boot up splash screen? Yet, this does not give off the impression of a final, polished release. What exactly happened here? For some parts, there's actually a definitive answer already out, and I've got my theories about the rest. When Player First Games took the beta offline, it turned out that a big part of what they were doing was rebuilding the entire game in a new engine to support a totally redone rollback netcode system. If you're working with a rollback algorithm, which has become the standard for fighters over the last few years, you can't just drag and drop it in. Every element of the game needs to be engineered with that specific algorithm in mind. That's why it took so long for it to start becoming the standard despite being established ages ago. Why some enormous titles like Smash Ultimate ended up not using it. Why I was watching the Rivals of Aether devs agonize over implementing rollback netcode for literal years. There are consequences you have to deal with for doing this. Developer comments have already confirmed that this rebuild was an enormous undertaking, as expected, and that some of these scrapped features were only scrapped because they didn't have time to rebuild them and will be getting added back. Some of them may already have been by the time you're watching this. Player First Games is not a huge studio. They're surprisingly modest for the sheer value of IPs they're working with, and I suspect that this back-end stuff ate up way too much of their development time in the period between beta and full release. The stuff that's not hard confirmed, like a clumsy UI and various bugs, may well be a victim of this schedule as well. The entire game just feels like it was rushed out the door. Not horrendously so. On PC it's very functional, although I've heard worse stuff about Xbox, but the entire thing is missing bits of polish all over the place. Rebuilding like this was likely a thankless project, an enormous amount of time, resources, and stress dedicated to something that almost nobody would even notice or appreciate, all for the sake of laying a better foundation for the game moving forward. The only part of this undertaking that might be widely regarded by players is the netcode, which, by the way, works great. I've had buttery smooth matches pretty much the entire time, and I live in Western Canada, not exactly the hub of connectivity. This applies a bit less to doubles, which is always going to be inherently less stable because you're connected to triple the amount of players, but I've definitely had more than triple the amount of disconnects. Still, even there, an average match runs great, and again, the actual moment-to-moment gameplay feels very smooth. That's cool, but it's not enough. Better system implementation is not going to satiate players who gave a game their money only to have it taken away from them for a year. What else is there then? Well, there's the expected handful of new characters, skins, and stages, as well as some character reworks. There are mechanical changes to areas besides speed and the addition of dash attacks, which I'll go over in a bit. They've added rifts, your relatively straightforward, this is a single-player mode in a fighting game kind of deal. It's fine. It's a cool excuse to have characters interact with each other more, and their interactions were already one of the most charming aspects of the game. As for the actual gameplay though, is gimmick fights interspersed with mini-games. There is some effort to add variety to a run. You've got stuff like target breaking, defending a crystal in a mini tank, jump rope. Each rift ends with a simplistic yet still welcome boss fight, but overall, it's about what you'd expect. It doesn't hold a candle to something like Super Smash Bros. Brawl's custom-built Subspace Emissary, or even the surprisingly robust roguelike that Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2 launched with, but it gets the job done. And done, and done, and done, because you are expected to grind this if you seriously want to progress your account. Each challenge comes with a bunch of other mini challenges to complete, like playing with a certain character, which, to be fair, is not a bad way to encourage trying more characters out, or landing a certain attack some number of times, which in practice means spamming it at the start and then being able to fight normally. You need to keep count yourself because there's no in-game progress tracker, and if you mess up, whether we're talking about dying or failing to complete a challenge, it takes way too long to hop back in and try again. You're not given an option to retry a level at the ending screen, you're always booted back to the map. And you, bafflingly, also can't retry or even quit out of the level from the pause menu. This is such a ridiculous oversight that no amount of presumed developer crunch can excuse it as far as I'm concerned. It's such a basic functionality consideration. Oh, and some of the branches are barricaded behind particular characters and even skins for those characters. And one of the mini challenges is always to bring someone else in with you, so rift rifts are literally impossible to clear solo. Be sure to treat anyone willing to stick it out with you like a saint, too, because each individual rift has 4 to 5 separate difficulty levels, all of which provide their own rewards, and progression is clearly balanced around clearing all of them. And these difficulty levels are themselves locked behind having your gems, a solo exclusive character customization mechanic, above a certain level, which you, of course, can pay real money for. Yeah, suddenly rifts have started going from tame but harmless enough to actively irritating. I'm sorry, but the content on offer here is not strong enough to justify that kind of time investment. It's a shame because I like some of the skins being offered, but I doubt I'll ever own them because I just don't have the time or interest needed. Well, maybe, because the devs have said they're working on a system to just let people purchase some of this stuff instead. Provided it's reasonably priced, this is fine. After all, free-to-play games still need to make money somehow. Will it be reasonably priced? Well, considering this guy costs 2,000 Gleamium and 6,000 Gleamium is $70 Canadian, you do the math on that one. To be fair, not all the skins cost this much. This is a legendary one which comes with more extensive remodeling and new voice work. But on the other hand, you also can't buy Gleamium in increments that match the cheaper skins. And even if you can earn a tiny amount through account progression, this is the kind of blatant, underhanded tactic that just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Maybe they needed to be more cutthroat with the prices because fighting game players are inclined to only deck out a character or two. Maybe this is on par with other free-to-play console games, a market I'm not deep into, or maybe it's sheer, unabashed greed. I couldn't really tell you. All I do know is that, to me, this seems overpriced, even as a content creator who can justify the cost of a couple of skins in exchange for some more visually interesting footage. And that's just about brushing up on the end of new content. Even completely ignoring the monetary side, that's still underwhelming for a year-long break. And frankly, how could it not be when the developers had to rebuild so much of what they'd already built? Well, in that case, why release it in this state? It's not like any of this is news to player-first games. They're closer to the project than anyone. They know what their feature list looks like. Developers don't get to make these calls, and considering we're talking about multi-million-dollar IPs being flung around like snowballs and enormous marketing ventures that needed to be coordinated eons ahead of time, it was probably unrealistic for the publisher too. I have no love for the publishing side of Warner Brothers, and it stenches all over plenty of MultiVersus' issues, but if you've got an NHL deal you need to coordinate God knows how long in advance, then yeah, you know what? At some point, you probably do need to tell the developers to just put out what they've got. Again, a lot of this is speculation, and regardless of the exact behind-the-scenes details, I don't envy the position player-first games found themselves in, but as a consumer, it's not really your job to care about any of this. When MultiVersus relaunched, what a lot of people saw was a game that, in many ways, had regressed from the beta, not even including the subjective gameplay direction. The monetization is more aggressive, the progression system less forgiving, the UI is worse, stuff is missing, you can't play offline. That's the kind of stuff that an average fan relogging in is going to care about. Even if you can tolerate stuff like the monetization, the developers are still undeniably playing catch up just to get back to where they were before. And after the game is caught up, it's undeniably going to be in a much better state to move forward, but hopefully the damage done doesn't take away a future for it to move forward into. And on top of all of that stuff, people are still shouting at them for subjective gameplay direction, shouting that I can't join in on because here's the thing. Despite all the issues I've brought up, I'm enjoying MultiVersus, and as far as pure gameplay goes, I far prefer it now compared to the beta. Nakat is one of the EVO winners for MultiVersus who was later brought onto player-first games in a community role, which means he's not a neutral source, but nevertheless has some interesting insight into some of these changes.
Before, it was like trying to play where you're preemptively always doing attacks because character mobility was super duper duper high. So because of that, you're able to kind of just zip around everywhere, zip, 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 right? And so because of that, it's very hard to hit people, let alone you don't really have too much whip lag on things. And so what I think makes a good fighting game not only is how the game feels to move around with, but of course accompanied with actual neutral play, whiff lag. If I do an option that has lag and I miss my opponent, I should be able to get hit. You are able to do that now, meaning you now have to play the game with the intention of trying to hit your opponent while also trying to remain safe. Your moves and your intentions all have much more meaning than they did before.
Yeah, in my experience, at least a good amount of that does track. MultiVersus still features too many characters with that button, a move that you can kind of just shamelessly mash with too little consequence too often. But this is a noticeably smaller issue than it used to be, and otherwise there are some aspects of the game speed I dislike, but overall I think it did accomplish its goals. The mix of flying squirrel fights and traditional fighter-esque ground neutral works for me, and it's not even played quite as slowly as I expected before I started getting a handle on it, and I mostly play slower characters. When I go back and look at my own recordings or top-level tournament footage from the beta period, yes, it was obviously much faster, but the faster it started being played, the less I thought of it. The unique air physics start to make characters look like toys being jerked around the screen when pushed too hard, and nothing being reactable means that frantic guesswork and flailing are the name of the game. If you're good, you're guessing and flailing better. This is all, of course, every bit as subjective as the issues that other people have with the slower speed. But, to me, this old footage now looks like it's being played in fast forward, which is not a compliment. The game's movement mechanics feel much more at home in the slower engine. If you really enjoyed being able to fly around the screen at mock speed like this, then I don't blame you for feeling limited by the new direction, but revisiting the beta hasn't made me any more surprised that the team thought changes were needed. The more nuanced take I've seen here is that yes, the game needed to slow down, but the developers took it just a bit too far. That I can buy more. I'm perfectly happy with the new speed, and I think a lot of these comments dramatically undersell the ripple effect it would have in other areas, but if it's feedback the devs did want to act on and bump things up a little, cool. I actively don't want it brought back to its beta speed though. Back in the beta, one of MultiVersus' biggest assets and problems was the way advanced movement was handled, which was primarily based around a dodge that you could cancel into other options while retaining momentum. You could dodge into a boosted jump, you could dodge into an attack, you could dodge diagonally upwards to perform an aerial at ground type because MultiVersus doesn't cancel aerials when they contact the ground. It was all cool tech, and still is, because it still exists. I've been showcasing it in the live game. The problem was that there was pretty much no reason not to do it all the time, and it turned out that giving everyone unlimited, invincible dashes into flying leaps turned disadvantaged state into kind of a joke. To compensate for this, the developers have now tied dodging to a meter system, which gets drained whenever you dodge and drained much faster if you cancel that dodge. If you run out of meter, you can still dodge, but they're no longer invincible and you don't get the same kind of cancel options anymore. This is, for the most part, a clever solution, and I like that it provides some reward to the aggressor, even if their attack doesn't actually connect. I criticize the beta combat for having kind of a flailing feel to it compared to other platform fighters, and that's not entirely gone. Even with the reduced speed making attacks easier to line up, sometimes you're still just going to be hitting air as your opponent spams dodge as fast as possible, but now at least you know you've burned a resource of theirs, so it feels a lot less frustrating. My main issue with the system is that in addition to making defense less smothering, the very fast meter burn and loss of attack canceling also shut off a lot of offensive applications, which I don't really think was the problem with the old system, and the way they do it isn't entirely cohesive. You dodged and disadvantaged too much, so we're taking away your invincibility to make you easier to hit is logical. Refilling the meter by engaging in combat is logical and ties into this. You're gonna have to fight for your invincibility, so we've taken away a bunch of your offensive tools. I'm not seeing the vision there as much. You don't want to limit a player's ability to do cool stuff just because. You want to limit a player's ability to do cool stuff if it's causing problems. Excessive invincibility was, absolutely, it was arguably the gameplay's biggest problem, but dodge canceling into an attack without any invincibility is essentially the same as approaching with a wave dash attack in Melee or its analogs. Does that really cause problems in the same way? A simple approaching forward air in this environment burns half your meter. Is that entirely necessary? Maybe, or maybe doing it retreating still turned out to be too strong. Maybe there were concerns about excessive jab loops, which could have been fixed in other ways. Maybe they found something I haven't even thought about. But at least on the surface, I'm less enthusiastic about this one. Overall though, I'd still call the new dodge system a huge upgrade, and part of my issue stems from liking what it enables so much that I wish I could do the cooler parts more often. The other big change to defense is the addition of a parry system, done by dodging in place and rewarding you with a freezing effect if it connects. This is very similar to how it works in Rivals of Ether, the major differences being that it can't reflect projectiles, which can be remedied with a perk, and that it also works even in the air. Air parrying does give the defense system more depth, and while the reward for mashing it out of hit stun and praying for an opponent's combo to not quite be true is kind of high, if it wasn't, nobody would ever even consider going for it instead of a relatively much safer directional dodge. I think you might be able to tone it down to, say, a repulse instead, which would still make it the most guaranteed way to escape disadvantage without creating cheesy reversals, but I'm not too concerned about it. I'd be even less concerned, though, if combos in MultiVersus didn't feel kind of tricky to gauge. There are a lot of extended loops and such that imply more extreme hit stun than the game actually has. A lot of other things that intuitively feel to me like they would be combos don't work in practice. Of course, my personal intuition doesn't actually mean anything, thing, but I've seen other people make the same comment. Maybe it comes down to the way knockback growth is handled so differently between attacks, maybe it's to do with how hit stun scales, maybe it's just the way attacks are communicated. MultiVersus generally has pretty polished animations from a technical perspective, but the functionality they convey does feel a bit rougher than a lot of their peers. Wonder Woman's down arrow was one of my biggest criticisms from the beta, and this hasn't been touched at all. She holds her sword out for a long time, which makes it look like there should be an extended hitbox on it, but it's actually just a brief stab. MultiVersus generally doesn't have all that many lingering sour spots in the first place, so this is partially just conditioning from the Smash series, which isn't even always entirely innocent itself, but there's certainly nothing wrong with having her do a full extension and then retract her arm for the recovery animation. Down airs in general are probably actually the worst looking move type across the roster. They don't all have that lingering hitbox illusion, but for functional reasons, characters float while doing them, which was always going to look a bit unnatural at a base level, but also clashes with a lot of the animation direction. From a more design-oriented angle, I love me a teleporting heavyweight, but what indication is there that Jason's missed step should even have a hitbox on it? He's just walking, and it's not like he hurts you by bumping into you normally. Well, okay, this is a different walk, I guess, but then why doesn't it hurt when he's stepping out of the fog too? Is it the fog that's causing the damage? If so, same question, why doesn't it work both ways? Don't get me wrong, the functionality here is totally fine. I don't even think it's subjective to say that the move is poorly communicated visually though. I've seen multiple people get tripped up by it. If this was, say, a hit grab where he dragged his opponent into and out of the fog with him, the concept would work great. The concept is already great behind Harley's baseball bat up special, on the other hand, but it is a weirdly nonchalant animation for one of her strongest kill moves. Bugs also kills off the top with a baseball bat, his up air in this case, and the Joker has a similar attack with a crowbar, and both of those look perfectly fine. Although, then this is one of Joker's signature kill moves too, and that one's even more confusing. I find myself saying, wait, that killed? In MultiVersus far more than any other platform fighter. Another issue I had with the beta, which has become worse if anything, with the addition of stronger kill moves. That doesn't mean I dislike the game's increased lethality overall though. The beta had generally low damage numbers and a lot of weak attacks, which made many hits feel too unimpactful even when the animation did sell it well. Wonder Woman's side air was, no bias, one of the biggest victims of this. That's a fantastic animation which implies it should hit like a truck, but it didn't, and now it does, and it feels so much better to land it's hard to describe. Feels like home. These changes are ubiquitous across the roster, with everyone generally doing more damage and moves killing earlier. The game also used to go out of the way to make attacks feel weak with an extremely harsh move scaling system that flashed a big downwards arrow and interrupted the usual hit sounds with a loud beep, which thankfully has been scrapped. Well, actually, not really. The scaling system still exists, it's just obfuscated now like it is in Smash. And like in Smash, I think it's just not a very good mechanic that does little to affect player behavior. Yes, adding the arrow did probably make it more impactful in this sense, and you could argue that hiding information from the player is a negative thing, but if the developers absolutely insist this mechanic needs to be here instead of just balancing moves in a way that makes them less spammable, I'd still rather the UI stop yelling at me. Just get it out of my face, it's not stopping me from spamming side air anyways, that thing hits hard. Now, some stuff in the game hits too hard. There's no way around that. Certain moves have clearly unintended use cases I expect to be fixed. That kind of thing doesn't worry me too much. Among the many setups that do seem intended though, I don't think it's wrong to have a more explosive environment than a game like Smash, but I also don't necessarily think it's ideal to have all the patterns so similar to each other. I'm oversimplifying obviously, but for an awful lot of the top tiers and many other characters besides, a lot of their game plan can be summed up as, I want to loop you, and then I want to ladder combo you. The first half is admittedly a lot less prominent now that jab loops have been universally patched out of the game. My mind was blown seeing these pop up in high-level play for the first time, and I still think they feel great to do, but realistically, yeah, half the roster's best move was jab. It was kind of ridiculous. In the original version of this video, I said that it felt like I was pulling a fast one on the devs, even though they obviously would have known about this, but considering I'm sitting here re-recording the entire segment on jab loops now, you know, maybe we actually did get one up on them for a bit. There were also jab loops available which didn't entirely rely on dodge canceling, and pretty much all of these were also surgically targeted individually, so safe to say this play pattern's not sticking around. Part of me thinks it's a bit of a shame that couldn't have just been reined in a bit instead of being entirely deleted, but at the end of the day, it's probably for the best. When it comes to ladder combos, on the other hand, these seem a lot more intentionally designed, and while they're not as obviously corny as being dragged across the stage for 10 seconds, I might actually argue they're more more problematic. They're even more dominant both in terms of ubiquitousness and power level, and they take what should be a wide, sweeping suite of inspired movesets and boil too many of them down to the same core strategy. If anyone needs to be nerfed in the future, this seems like the de facto starting point a lot of the time. Looking at you, Wonder Woman? Speaking of which, alright. So, Wonder Woman is my main, as you might have guessed, and one of my favorite platform fighter characters ever, and the Grapple of Hermes is one of my favorite platform fighter moves ever. In the beta, this was on a long cooldown similar to a MOBA, like way too many attacks in MultiVersus. There were and are some where it made sense, but a ton of these just felt like lazy, obtrusive balancing, which is why I was so delighted when the full game launched, and a ton of those cooldowns have been removed completely, including the lasso ones, which you've seen a lot of footage of throughout the video. I originally had this whole big section written up about how happy I was to see the devs improving their approach and how much better the game felt. And then, in the middle of making this video, they went and added it back for the lasso. I hate this so much, and I hate having to retract my initial praise to the developers for figuring out that cooldown meters don't just make characters worse, they also make them less fun, for figuring out that there were way too many tiny meters to keep track of on screen, and the more of those they could clean up, the better. That saying, you don't get to do cool stuff all the time, only when the timer allows you, hurts the game's feel significantly. Like I said, there are times when cooldowns make perfect sense. Even on Wonder Woman's kit, I'd never argue that the move that self-applies armor should be available whenever you want it. But if you can get away with axing a cooldown, as far as I'm concerned, you essentially always should. In their introductory video, it's kind of funny that Player First Games specifically talks about removing as many pain points from the genre as possible because, yeah, Wonder Woman is considered a top tier at time of upload, and I couldn't care less about playing a top tier. By all means, tone her down. I agree she probably needs it. There are a million ways you could do it while still keeping her just as fun to play, either by changing the lasso or, frankly, far more egregious aspects of her kit. But the solution they went with here was, as far as I'm concerned, just about the single worst one they could have picked. If they were to, say, make the lasso slower so it took a better read to land a hit, then okay, cool, that's my new tool. How do I make it work? With a cooldown, there is no making it work. It's a binary, you can use it or you can't. As someone who really likes using it, this single-handedly hurts my interest in playing her moving forward. Not only is it a nerf via cooldown, it's also a nerf to her mobility, something I'd consider a sacred cow of platform fighters. Except that's not actually always true because Wonder Woman can choose between 3 different types of lasso, which all function very differently and all got an identical balance pass. Now, this isn't meant just to be a rant about my main getting nerfed. Okay, maybe slightly. But the bigger issue here is that if they took this approach once, they'll probably take it again. I was unlucky to be in the line of fire because Wonder Woman is the only character to be hit with a new cooldown so far, but not that many characters have been changed so far either. There are also carried over cooldowns that I still consider to be getting used as a crutch, and I could beat around the bush with a few examples, but it's Taz. It's the Tasmanian Devil. I actually love a lot of the roster's design, as we'll get into shortly, but Taz shows off all the worst of MultiVersus' tropes, and his up special has to be one of the biggest offenders. Where the hell are the hitbox and hurtbox even supposed to be on this blob? MultiVersus has work to do on its hitboxes in general. There are a lot of weird ones, both strong and weak, that need to be fixed, but this is different. There's no way to fix it. The concept is fundamentally broken. It's also just generally poorly balanced. It lasts forever, it can be cancelled, and it has too little end lag on it to leave him accountable in any real way, and the only thing balancing it is a cooldown, which I don't think is justification. There's a reason that other platform fighters don't have moves like this. No cooldown on up tilt though, which I would be very curious to hear the designer's thought process behind. This can be charged indefinitely. He can walk freely with it as the fastest character in the game. It hits through platforms, it hits beside him, the charge is unreactable, meaning it can't be reliably parried, it kills, it sets up his signature food ability. I talked about too many characters having that button in MultiVersus, and if this isn't the most egregious one in the game, it's gotta be up there. I don't think he's overpowered, and early tier lists seem to agree at this point, but that doesn't mean I think he's a healthy design at all. He is still, at the very least, an interesting character full of lovingly crafted references to his series though, and this, thankfully, is the way the roster is handled across the board. Joker has a moveset that feels, appropriately, kind of insane, with a huge arsenal of tools and attacks that can have different outcomes at different times, whether on a set rotation, controlled by him, or even because of some minor RNG elements. And while the game is loaded with world-class voice acting, Mark Hamill is an especially big get.
Dibs on the skinny one that smells growls like a dog.
Shaggy is the closest thing to a Smash analog the game has, with what's clearly a reference to Captain Falcon's knee, but even then, he's closer to Street Fighter's Ryu than anything. And given that he's meant to be MultiVersus' mascot, benchmark, as well as a bit of a joke character, it makes sense to import a bunch of fan-favorite ideas in a new way. Jason is as close to an authentic slasher as you could make before things started getting really dark. He turns himself invincible, he walks menacingly towards you, and it's up to you to weave around his flurry of straightforward machete and axe attacks. He feels incredibly satisfying to use, and I love his sound design. It's infused with classic horror strings and scrapes, and those rusty metal hits are some of the best in the game. MultiVersus' sound design is generally quite good, especially among the other more conventional weapon slashes. But that being said, there are some misses here. I think the heavier impacts pretty much all sound great. But then when it comes to the lighter attacks, most of them are fine, if a bit squelchy for my personal tastes, although a few do seem surprisingly thin and weak sounding. For the most part, this is a minor nitpick at best. But then we get to Banana Guard, and... Is it just me, or does that sound awful? At least there's no tipper mechanic on the spear, which would only make the hefty feeling shaft hits and limp stabs feel more strange beside each other. But on the other hand, isn't it kind of strange not to give a spear fighter a tipper mechanic in the first place? Then again, even that would probably be too much of a twist for Banana Guard, who is, no joke, the least interesting character I've ever seen in a platform fighter. The thing is, though, I think they've done that on purpose. I've never seen Adventure Time, but I still know this is clearly supposed to be a joke. One of his respawn lines is literally,
I am 98% sure I am still the same Banana Guard.
So, fine, an absolute nothing of a character gets an absolute nothing of a moveset. I think I'm on board with that. They even gave him the boring neutral air that gets thrown all over the Smash roster, which I'm sure wasn't an accident. Although, if you're gonna do that, it really should work like the Smash ones with the lingering hitbox. The animation here is blatantly misleading by any standard. He's actually so boring that he doesn't even start off with any status effects besides a self buff, which by MultiVersus standards is extremely conservative, arguably to the game's detriment sometimes. The designers took character faithfulness to heart more than maybe any other platform fighter, which in many ways is fantastic, but it also includes relying on a mountain of different status effects, meters, and passives to convey everyone's canonical abilities. This may be drawing from some other genres like MOBAs and hero shooters, which pull it off fine, and I've always respected MultiVersus for having very little worship of Melee, a game most platform fighters still feel indebted to. That's not a knock against those games by any means, they're some of my favorites, but it's still refreshing to see a platform fighter doing its own thing, and pulling from other entries like Brawlhalla, which also do their own thing. That said, some of these designs feel like they're getting a little lost in the sauce. Harley Quinn applies an invisible confetti status to an opponent with some of her moves, and then when they've got confetti on them, each further hit they take applies a stack of Ignite, and then when they've got 5 stacks of Ignite, they get lit on fire, and the end result of all of this is a small bit of damage over time, unless you choose a perk that replaces Ignite with a small explosion, and at the very least the confetti status is visible now, but it's yet another meter. Imagine if Inkling in Smash Ultimate worked this way, except the sign they're popping up above everyone's head is one of dozens of signs you need to memorize the effects of. The direction MultiVersus went with is admittedly in some ways cleaner, it gives you hard numbers and standardizes the visual language, but it also involves throwing even more stuff onto an already very busy screen. And while no individual character's mechanics are insanely complicated, there are a lot of them that can quickly start to stack up. If you haven't read through everyone's movesets, which is a lot to ask for most players, you're probably going to be very confused as to why Harley's attacks are suddenly lighting you on fire, or alternatively, what the hell this even means. It's incredibly unfriendly towards newer and younger players even now, is not a particularly future-proof design philosophy as the roster continues to expand, and a giant glossary tossed into the corner of the home screen isn't much of a solution. Yes, like with cooldowns, this kind of stuff is established in other genres that I don't play that much, so you could just argue I'm not used to it. Yes, MultiVersus has characters heavily built around resource management and status effects where removing them wouldn't and shouldn't be an option. In the case of a character like Harley though, and she's far from the only one like this, she already has a well-defined identity and playstyle that has very little to do with the confetti mechanic. You could remove it entirely and she'd feel essentially exactly the same. I would argue that these kinds of cuts are generally a fair trade for improving the game's clarity. I've brought up perks a couple of times, which are back from the beta and in a much better balanced state. Previously, some of them were an extra jump and some of them were not, that, and characters started off without any perks unlocked, meaning that matchmaking could put you against opponents who were objectively stronger than you. Many more of these new perks are worth considering, and each character now also has a full set of perks off the bat, as well as 3 pre-built loadouts, giving everyone a good foundation to work with while they unlock the more specialized options. I do think that one of these starting loadouts could have more anti-projectile focus though. I'm a lot more lenient towards the zoning soup MultiVersus throws onto some characters when these kinds of countermeasures are available, but you're asking for players to potentially deal with a lot of frustration in some matchups before they have them. While I've seen some complaints that the more balanced perks are less interesting, I don't necessarily think it's the worst idea to avoid taking an already large, intricate roster and giving every character a huge amount of variation even past that. The Airwalker perk alone, which replaces air parrying with the ability to spawn a platform under your feet, already creates wildly different playstyles and follow-ups, and signature perks are still around to double down on this. These are still a lot of the most interesting variations, character-specific changes like giving Banana Guard the choice between getting a projectile shield while applying his self buff, or applying an ice effect with his crying attacks. When I talked about Wonder Woman's lasso variants, these are where they came from, and they're a fantastic showcase for the system. 2 alternate lassos to choose from apart from the default, the Grapple of Hermes and then the Whip of Hephaestus, which trades any kind of pulling action for a dangerous kill hitbox at the tip. It's especially great in zoning matchups where projectiles can get in the way of the others, and then the Grapple of Hermes creates such a radical playstyle change that it almost feels like playing a new character. She's even got a totally different anti-projectile perk if you're happy with the default lasso. Yeah, Wonder Woman was treated very well here, which can't be said for everyone. She's got 3 signature perks, but some characters only get 2, and they're not all valid in all formats. Jason theoretically has 2 cool ones that are always valid, Monstrous Step, which automatically moves him behind opponents when coming out of Missed Step, and then the very in-character Resurrectionist, which brings him back to life for a few seconds the first time he dies. This is a fun idea that works okay in doubles, but even though it's usable in singles, it's comically weak, and is clearly balanced around also being able to give it to Jason's teammate and being harder to run away from. I personally think Monstrous Step also feels underwhelming. I find the inability to control my teleport position creates a lot of headaches, but this one's heart was certainly in the right place, and at least the concepts behind both of his signature perks are cool, even if it's kind of lame that there isn't a third one to choose from. Arya Stark, on the other hand, also only gets 2 signature perks, one of which automatically gives her an opponent's face after she kills them, vaguely like if Kirby in Smash automatically got his hat. And that's a great idea in either format. But then her other perk literally doesn't even function unless she has a teammate to interact with. This sucks. The developers still insist that doubles is the format to play, but too bad. I like singles more, so do a lot of people, and thankfully the mechanical changes have made it so that in most areas it's a much better game mode than it was in the beta. To see these perks stagnate like this though, to see that they couldn't think of 3 for everyone that would work in both game modes, or say 2 and then a double-centric one, is pretty underwhelming. It turns what should be an excellent feature into something that's either an excellent feature or kind of half-baked depending on who you're playing. There's always at least one choice to make because everyone can also swap out their signature perks for a generic 5% boost to offense and defense, which is solid, but not exciting. Moving on to stages, I generally like them. There's an interesting mix of static layouts with some relatively unobtrusive interactive elements, and then it also includes some arenas that make use of walls. MultiVersus doesn't have teching in it, so you can actually get wall combos going, which are fun to pull off and further solidify the slightly traditional fighter-esque feel that's crept its way in. I also like the approach of starting out many of these stages a bit more extreme and then having them degrade over time into simpler layouts. And there's a hazards toggle to tone down everything if you don't like stages getting in the way too much, which is nice because there are also some pretty heavy-handed stages here that if they were Smash stages, I probably wouldn't even have played on as a kid. Particularly the city of Townsville. Yeah, I'm sorry, this is just not fun even casually. The hazards are constant and many of them are extremely disruptive and deadly, and for some godforsaken reason they decided to put this stage into singles. Yes, it's on ranked singles, but that's the only option available at the moment. What the fuck is this doing here? This stage playlist is frankly pretty bad, even for what's presumably a less serious setting. The fact that there aren't ranked points doesn't do anything to prevent circle camping on the multiple huge disruptive layouts it throws at you, but Townsville in particular just feels like a middle finger. You know full well that a ton of people coming into the game mode don't want to deal with this crap. After the ranked mode is up and running, whatever. I'd still argue that stuff like the laser needs to stop instantly vaporizing people, but at the very least, I'm not going to have to deal with it anymore. And that's about where we're at with MultiVersus. For all the things it does well, there are just way too many issues to call it a great game right now by any objective standard. And on top of that, the more I played, the more this pervasive meanness reared its head. The free taunt emote everyone gets is a salt shaker, and the winner of a match has a few seconds to roam the stage, as opposed to Smash, which immediately stops showing you your opponent's inputs. I don't have much of a temper when it comes to video games, and this stuff doesn't really get to me, but it got to me more than usual when I was getting footage for this video because it was one more thing stacked on top of a long list of frustrations. I don't understand why to this day, Bugs can still set up a stupid chasing minigame that grinds everything to a halt for a very long time, and if you guess wrong, he can kill you at any percent. When it comes to Wonder Woman, I at least see the vision more for what a healthy version of her would look like, but as is, she's still equally responsible for the smothering of character diversity I've noticed coming in for even the online meta. The top tiers in MultiVersus are so oppressive in such obvious ways, and I'm not saying nothing is going to be done. The devs are working hard and have outlined a huge list of targets including character balance, which will hopefully make this video age like milk. But it's just disappointing to still be here, because for all intents and purposes, this is MultiVersus' second beta, and their first in a new engine. They couldn't call it that again, of course, but no exaggeration, that's what this is. Maybe through unfortunate circumstances, maybe not, but either way, it's not finished. That said, you need to wade through a lot of unfinished stuff, but man, when you get a good game in MultiVersus, it's really good. There's a satisfaction to landing a nice play here that feels different than other platform fighters, and while the pacing may not be for everyone, it is for me. I like fast games too, but I have no trouble accepting this one on its own merits. And while saying this could be great with enough time and work is a bad cop-out that applies to literally anything, it is worth noting the player-first games have been extremely receptive to feedback so far. And if there's anything positive I can say, even cynically about Warner Brothers, they want their marketing vehicle up and running. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen the Battle Pass go from atrocious to far more lenient. And while if I was one of the devs, I'd be furious to have my creation soured by the initial system, at the very least, the pressure fans applied did have results. There's still a long way to go, which is disappointing to say for a game that's supposedly fully launched, but there is something here. I'll be sticking around, at least for now, and we'll see what it turns into. Thanks for watching.